The double leg is probably the most effective and most commonly used takedown in MMA, but there are several variations to it. In this video, I'm going to try my best to break down those variations through my sparring footage and explain the pros and cons of each variation. I'm going to go in chronological order from my favorite variations to the least favorite. The first variation is the head on the inside standing double leg. I also call it a football tackle. This is, in my opinion, the most powerful and fastest variation. To perform, change levels, step your lead or rear leg forward, but it's usually the lead leg forward, and put your head on the inside as you grab behind your opponent's knees with each arm. Then from there, you literally drive forward by running and pulling your opponent's legs to the opposite side of your head. This is why I call it a football tackle. You just change levels and tackle and run. By driving forward and running, you are often able to lift your opponent's legs right up into the air and dive into a takedown. Standing double leg takedowns are the most powerful because you stay on your 2 feet. But it is super tough to score this type of takedown if your opponent is super low, like the way they stand in pure wrestling. On the other hand, this takedown works really well in MMA when your opponent stands taller to strike. Head on the inside also leaves your neck vulnerable for a guillotine, but if you can surprise your opponent with a fast shot, they won't have time to guillotine you. Notice that all this footage is MMA sparring, which means my opponents are striking and standing taller, which allows me to get underneath them while standing. You'll see later when I break down the knee drop double leg that some of the footage is pure grappling and my opponents stand lower, which forces me to drop to my knee. In all these takedowns, I can get my opponent up in the air, but I am unable to lift them and carry them on top of my shoulder. It's because my head is on the inside and I'm looking forward when performing the takedown, which makes it difficult for me to posture up and lift my opponent on top of my shoulder. You'll see later on the head on outside takedown where it's easier to carry your opponent on your shoulder. Now, the biggest tip for finishing the takedown is by driving forward, especially when your opponent defends by sprawling. The idea is to grab your opponent's legs and trap them there and run forward. When your opponent sprawls, but you can lift up at least one leg, you can run while your opponent is hopping only on one leg, and you'll eventually be able to catch that second leg and finish the takedown. Of course, there is a downfall to committing forward so hard, which is your opponent might reverse you and throw you over their head. The second variation is the head on the inside knee drop to standing double leg takedown. Dropping to your knee is definitely less powerful, but the reason people use it is to close more distance by dropping to their knee and sweeping their rear leg forward. Dropping to your knee is also good for really getting underneath your opponent so you can lift them up. As I mentioned before, if your opponent is also a pure wrestler who stands very low, it is tough to get underneath them with a standing double leg, so you want to drop to your knee to get as low as you can. To perform, you want to shoot your lead leg in between your opponent's legs and place your head on the inside as you penetrate by dropping your knee in between your opponent's legs as you grab behind your opponent's knees. Then sweep your back leg forward, which is where the power comes from. Then push off that sweeping leg to stand back up onto both legs and lift your opponent's legs to the opposite side of your head to finish the takedown. So in this case, lifting your legs to the right. This variation and the first variation, both having your head on the inside, is a more unorthodox way of performing your double leg. The standard way is to have your head on the outside and where you would lift your legs to the same side where your head's at. But what I like about the head on inside double leg takedown is that it feels easier to dive into your takedown. When I say dive, I mean literally diving by throwing your head into the ground and kicking your legs up into the air, slamming your shoulder into your opponent's guts as you land. Now, although with the knee drop you can get lower underneath your opponent, because the head is still on the inside, it makes it difficult to look up and lift your opponent on top of your shoulder. So when would I use this variation over the first variation? Simply when it is a grappling only match and I need to get lower to get underneath my opponent, or when I want to close more distance by dropping with my knee then sweeping my leg forward. Just know that it is less powerful. Now, if you are looking to learn how to develop the power and strength to perform your best double leg takedown, make sure to check out my strength and conditioning program by clicking the link in the description box below. The third variation is your standard knee drop to standing double leg takedown with your head on the outside. This is how most people will perform a double leg takedown. To perform, shoot your lead leg in between your opponent's legs, drop to your knee as you place your head on the outside and grab behind your opponent's knees. Then sweep the back leg forward for power, push off that leg as you stand up and lift your opponent's legs to the same side of the sweeping leg, so in this case, lifting the legs to my left. Look at how keeping your head on the outside allows you to look up and see how although my opponent sprawled on me, I was still able to sweep my leg forward so that I can stand on my 2 feet and literally squat up to get him in the air. The goal is to get back up onto both of your feet, whether that is to lift your opponent right up into the air or to try and run forward while you trap behind your opponent's knees. If your opponent does not sprawl fast enough, it's likely that you'll be able to pick them right up. And if your opponent sprawls their legs back in time, then you'll have to stand up and run. Notice how I'll sweep my back leg forward and off to the side so I can create a bit of an angle and try to circle around them as I tackle them down. In this example here, my opponent was less experienced in grappling, but see how we were at a dead stop, but I was still able to push forward to stand up. Variation 4 is the exact same thing, except you stay on your knee. Sometimes your opponent is too heavy to stand up completely onto both feet, and sometimes you're able to shoot in so deep that you don't even need to. But when this happens, you must cut that angle by sweeping that back leg 45 degrees to the side and turning, as well as continue to drive. The fifth variation is a standing double leg, starting from one stance and transitioning into the opposite stance while performing the takedown. So in my case, I'm standing in Orthodox stance and I shift to Southpaw to finish my takedown. I do this when I am in Orthodox stance and my opponent is in Southpaw stance. I shift to Southpaw so that my head can be placed on the outside. To perform this, I will change levels, then slide my rear leg forward and step outside of my opponent's rear leg as I grab behind my opponent's knees, then push off my right leg as I lift my opponent's legs up to my left to finish the takedown. This variation is a tad slower simply because you want to stand in the same stance as your opponent when shooting for the double in order to get your lead knee in between your opponent's legs. Since you and your opponent are in the opposite stance, you now need to step into the same stance as your opponent before going for the takedown. The sixth variation is your standard standing double leg takedown. To perform, change levels and step your lead leg in between your opponent's legs, then place your head on the outside as you grab behind the knees and drive forward as you lift your opponent's legs to the same side as your back leg to finish the takedown. I know there are so many variations that it gets confusing, but at the end of the day, they are all pretty much the same. The key things to remember is to step your leg as deep as you can to get under your opponent as much as you can, grab behind your opponent's knees, lift their legs up and to one side, keep your head up as much as you can, keep your back straight, and always drive forward, especially when your opponent sprawls to defend. Now let's talk a bit about chain wrestling. I mentioned the double leg takedown is the most effective takedown for MMA, in my opinion at least, but like all techniques, they do fail depending on how skilled your opponent is or how skilled you are at performing them. When shooting for the double leg, and you are able to grab hold of at least one leg, try to drive forward to finish as I've already demonstrated. But if that doesn't work, try to transition to another takedown. For example, here I transitioned into an outside leg trip. I wasn't able to pick my opponent up because he had really strong hips and he was driving them forward, so I had to hook the leg to tip him over. In this scenario here, my opponent was doing a great job at leaning forward, so I transitioned into this inside leg trip. And over here, my opponent drives his hips forward for a strong sprawl again, so I circled around to take his back. Another scenario where my opponent's defense caused a scramble and I managed to take the back again. Over here, I transitioned into a single leg, then back into a double leg. And in the next example, I transitioned into the body lock. These are just sparring examples that I could find of myself, but the options are endless. If you enjoyed this double leg compilation, let me know in the comments below. Perhaps you want to see a compilation on another technique. As usual, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe.